Good morning, and welcome to the first webinar in CClear's 5th Annual New York State Virtual Redevelopment Summit. I hope that many of you were able to join us for our summit kickoff this morning, but if you didn't, it was recorded and will be put into the LinkedIn networking group, and you will also receive it in your emails automatically this evening, so watch out for that if you missed it. So I'm really pleased to welcome you all to this first webinar, Land Banks as a Force for Community Revitalization and Equity. For those of you, just a point of interest, this summit was supposed to be in person, as many of you know, and was supposed to include a lovely tour of Troy, New York. This is an aerial photo of Troy, New York, so that's the best I can do under the circumstances, so hope you enjoyed that. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Center for Creative Land Recycling, I'm just going to give you a quick overview. Our mission is to promote the sustainable, equitable, and responsible use of underutilized and environmentally impacted properties. We educate, advocate, assist, and convene stakeholders to revitalize communities through land recycling. We are also EPA's technical assistance to brownfield provider, or TAB provider, for 10 states and numerous territories around the country, including New York. I won't go too deep into this slide because I covered it pretty well in the summit kickoff, but basically just an overview of what we do. We provide one-on-one technical assistance. We host national webinars. We organize workshops and conferences. Usually they're in person. And we disseminate newsletters and online resources with a number of different resources, land recycling resources, funding opportunities, that type of thing. Before we get started, I do want to mention and thank the American Planning Association Upstate New York chapter. This webinar is accredited through the American Planning Association New York Upstate chapter. AICP planners who complete this webinar can receive 1.25 certification maintenance credits. And the code to record that is right there in the slide. And AICP members should report the credits the same way as they would for a live event, through your APACM log. And if any of this information is just sort of soaring past you, I know it does for me when I'm trying to write things down and listen at the same time. You don't have to. The slide deck, the full slide deck, including the presenter slides, are included in your dashboard under the Handouts tab. So just a couple housekeeping items that I want to mention to make sure you get the most out of this. This webinar does include visuals. Speakers will present for about 45 minutes and then engage in discussion and Q&A for the remaining time. You will receive a recording of this webinar 4 hours or so after the broadcast ends, and it'll come automatically in your email. And then the other thing is that we really appreciate your feedback, so please respond to the survey following this webinar. So engagement opportunities, we're trying to replicate an in-person summit. It's very challenging, but we do our best. So how can you engage with speakers? To ask a question, you can type in the lower box of your dashboard, and you can mark it for either moderators or everyone. And that's how we'll take Q&A at the end of this webinar. You should utilize the Summit exclusive LinkedIn group. I talked about this a lot during the Summit kickoff. Post questions there and tag speakers. These speakers are all part of the LinkedIn group, so we can keep the conversation going. I will be posting some thought questions in the LinkedIn group specifically about this panel after the broadcast ends. If you pose a question in the questions box and we aren't able to address it in the broadcast, you can either pose the same one in LinkedIn and we can handle it there, or we will respond to you over the next couple weeks and then get back to you. I want to thank our very generous sponsors for supporting us throughout this process, for helping us move this summit to an online platform. We are very thankful for our sponsors' support. So if you see them, thank them. You hear them, interact with them in any way. And now I'd like to I would like to shine a spotlight on one of our generous sponsors, Great American Insurance Group, Barry Geisler. Barry's gonna come up and show.
Thank you, Claire.
There we go. Thank you.
Everybody can see me now. Good morning. As Claire mentioned, my name is Barry Geisler. I am the Chief Underwriting Officer for Great American Insurance Company's Environmental Division. We are a new sponsor of C-Clear, and on behalf of the division and all the employees of Great American, I want to thank you for your continued support of C-Clear, and I want to say how excited we are about our involvement in this fantastic organization. Great American is a specialty property and casualty insurance company whose roots can be traced back to 1872. Today, Great American is part of the American Financial Group, a Fortune 500 company traded on the New York Stock Exchange under symbol AFG. Our nearly 8,500 employees in approximately 120 locations throughout North America and Europe provide the strength and expertise that make AFG a leader in the insurance and financial services industries. I've been with Great American's environmental division for more than a decade. We offer an exclusive focus on environmental insurance solutions to a wide variety of commercial customers, with a complete portfolio of environmental products, including coverage for contractors and for pollution events at fixed locations. We specialize in coverage for brownfield redevelopments and offer many solutions to help facilitate commercial real estate transactions and the repurposing of distressed locations. We build a motivated group of insurance professionals who are experts in underwriting, risk management, environmental science, and claims handling, all of whom are committed to customer service. For more information about Great American and the environmental division and our products and services, I invite you to visit our website, gaig.com/environmental. Under very challenging circumstances, C-Clear has once again put together an excellent program. I hope everyone enjoys this great networking and learning opportunity. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Barry. And I also want to mention that you can hear more from Great American Insurance Group in the Friday office hours at 2 o'clock. Okay, so watch out for that. All right. And now I'm going to pass things off to our moderator, Gary Rosnes, Senior Consultant at GEI Consultants.
Well, thank you, Claire, and good morning to everybody. I did take a look this morning at the people who had signed up for this webinar, and I was pleased to see so many people I know, so many people who are friends. So even though I can't see you face to face, spirit to spirit, I'm with you. So good morning to you all. It's also my pleasure to moderate today's panel discussion, which is, as you know, land banks as a force for community revitalization and equity. For context and some comparison, I put together and moderated a panel on land banks at the 2015 EPA Brownfields Conference in Chicago. And I had Suffolk County Land Bank as one of the principal presenters, as well as several other land banks in the Midwest at that time. Suffolk County Land Bank was then obviously 5 years younger than they are now, but their mission at that time is the same as today, and it's clear, however, from that time, somewhat groundbreaking as well. I'm happy to have worked with the land bank in Suffolk County as well. Today, it's well established that land banks play a pivotal role in community revitalization. And with us here to talk about this today is Adam Zarenko, who is the Executive Director of the Albany County Land Bank. Sarah Lansdale, who is the Director of Planning and Environment for the Suffolk County Land Bank. And Caitlin Wright, who is the Executive Director of the Greater Syracuse Land Bank. And Claire, I give it back to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I'm going to launch a couple polls now so that we can get a sense of where you guys are in terms of your understanding of land banks and what you want to learn about. So I'm going to launch the first poll now. Okay. Here we go. And so this first poll is, in what capacity have you worked with your local land bank? And you can click all that apply. So go ahead and go through this. The entity I work for purchased a property from a land bank. The entity I worked for has partnered with a land bank to combine resources or work on a project. My firm responded to an RFP issued by a land bank or was hired to work on a project. I facilitated reuse through rezoning, or I have not worked with land banks in any formal capacity, but would like to learn more about them. Okay, let's see here. So we're collecting responses. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now so I can share results. Okay, so many of you haven't worked with, have not worked with land banks in any formal capacity, but would like to learn more about them. So that's great. This is the place to do it. A few of you have partnered with land banks to combine resources or work on a project. So we're going to learn a lot more about that. Okay, so I'm going to hide that poll. And I'm going to launch the next one. In which of the following ways is your local land bank active in your community? Select all that apply. They've been instrumental in redeveloping a local brownfield, played a role in creating and preserving affordable housing, partnered with a land trust to create and preserve green space. Oh, I haven't watched it. I'm so sorry. There we go. Lots of buttons to push. I'll give you a moment to read over the questions. Excellent. The votes are rolling in. Good. Give it another moment since I was late to the game, pressing that annoying little launch button. Excellent. Okay, the votes are rolling in, and it looks like the majority of those who are voting say that their local land bank played a role in creating and preserving affordable housing. So that's great. We are going to talk a lot more about that today. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. Here we go. So you can see for yourself what people voted for. So it's a pretty good mix, though, I have to say. All right, so I'm going to hide that poll. Excellent. So now you should all be seeing that slide. Fantastic. So thank you for participating in these polls. That gives us our panelists a good base, a good groundwork to in their discussion and then also in their presentations. So now I'm going to go ahead and hand this back off to our first speaker, Adam Zarenko from the Albany County Land Bank.
Thank you, Claire. Pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this CClear conference, and thank you for all that are attending to learn about land banks. I see from the poll that hopefully we can reach a lot more people with the different utility that land banks can offer with respect to reclaiming vacant properties. And you saw in the second poll that there's a lot of different ways that land banks can help add value. There is no perfect way, so it can be tailored to each community. I'm Adam Zarenko. I'm the executive director of the Albany County Land Bank. I'm going to give a quick land banks in New York primer and talk a little bit about some of the work we've done at our land bank, and then you'll learn more from other land banks after this. So first question I get often is, what is a land bank? If we can go to the next slide. A land bank is essentially, at least in New York State, a not-for-profit corporation, an entity that works in collaboration with community members and local governments. And really what we do is we have special statutory authority granted to us under state law that equips communities and local governments with the tools they need to tackle vacant and abandoned properties, which have been historically a really big burden on local governments and communities. And with COVID-19, we'll talk about a little bit later, expected to be continue to be bad, if not worse than the 2008 levels. We can go to the next slide. So land banks function best as a platform between all these different partners, and so there is no potential partner that a land bank won't explore working with. I can say that at least for our land bank. Land banks are essentially groups that want to use their special powers to make things possible or viable that weren't possible without a land bank, and that could be around their resources, their authority, and their land. So land banks are not new. The earliest land banks date back to the Midwest in the 1970s. New York State's land banks are part of the third wave of land banks that you see across the country. They really started to pop up in the United States, primarily in the eastern half of the United States, after the 2008 foreclosure crisis. Most land banks are enabled through their state legislation. And right now, Georgia, Michigan, New York, and Ohio are the states that have the most land banks. So New York is part of that third statewide wave. And you see a lot more, especially as we face down the issues that will come out of the COVID-19 pandemic around the economic impacts. A lot more land banks are being explored in the state of New York, but also nationally. And there was recently a bill introduced in Congress to create a national land bank network, essentially to bolster the practices, the best practices, and share them to other areas, because land banks can really offer value to just about any community in the country. So I often get asked, especially if you've been around some of upstate New York cities, why are there so many vacant properties? Why per capita does, Albany have one vacant building for every 90 people, and so on and so forth? There is no one reason. A really simplified way to boil it down in reverse chronological order, though, is there's been kind of three major policy and practice implications that have led to this number that we're facing today. So the first is the 2008 foreclosure crisis. We're all familiar with that. We were all here for that. It really created a big challenge of vacant and abandoned properties that many of our communities in the nation, but especially upstate New York, are still trying to recover from today. I mean, here we are, it's 2020, 12 years later, and a lot of communities are still struggling with the impacts of 2008. Next. The second is pre-2008, from around 1950 to 2010, a little bit beyond that. There was a migration. It wasn't just New York State, but we're focused on New York State here. That's where our land bank is. A hollowing out of the urban core. So the legacy cities, the industrial cities that used to be the economic engines of upstate New York and most of the New England. People that had the economic mobility to leave the city with the advent of the highway system and other government sanctioned policies did that. I mean, they moved to the suburbs. So if you look at this graph here, it shows the population change. I highlight the blue one, that's where we work. But from the city of Albany from 1950 to 2010 lost 27% of its population, while the surrounding county grew by 27%. And you see that trend consistent on different levels, other major upstate urban centers. What that exacerbated was some of the impacts of the next slide we're going to jump to, which is the inequitable policies and practices, which have rightfully come back to the forefront of the national discourse, which is, government sanctioned programs and practices, specifically in our housing space that we work in, the practice of redlining, which is the purposeful disinvestment in communities of color. So this is a redlining map from 1930 for the city of Albany. This is from 1938. So these HOPE maps were sanctioned by the government, and you can find them online. And this is an exercise we learned from our partners at Center for Community Progress. And so the red lines, the red areas here are the city of Albany's most economically distressed neighborhoods today: West Hill, Arbor Hill, Sheridan Hollow, and South End, and these are minutes from the capital of the state of the Empire State. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll see that legacy, the impact of that legacy, and the disparities of that cause. These dots are the real estate activity of the Albany County Land Bank through about 2019. So there's actually more dots if we updated this slide, but you can see overlaid on the redlining map. So you can see the legacy of those decisions and the impact that we're still struggling with today. That is all of our acquisitions, improvements, sales, and inventory in the city of Albany. So the map pretty much speaks for itself. The issue is real and it's systemic. And like I said, rightfully so, it's at the top of many more people and policymakers' minds. We're still struggling to reverse some of the things that were set in motion in the 1930s today. And with COVID coming and the impacts thereof, we really need to start to intervene, and land banks are definitely one way to mitigate what was going to be a really destructive economic force on neighborhoods that haven't gotten turned around yet. We go next slide. And so, you know, we talk a lot about this. Again, it's a national conversation topic now. We've been looking at this here in Albany County for about 2 years now. Albany and Buffalo have among the largest home ownership gaps between white and black homeowners for cities of our size in the nation, which is completely unacceptable, but a consequence of that systemic, you know, racist policies dating back from the early 1900s and that were exacerbated by all those things I highlighted. I mean, this is not unique to our city, but it is certainly something that we need to think about if you're going to stabilize and revitalize neighborhoods and create more equitable opportunities and mitigate the disproportionate impacts that COVID-19 has had on communities of color. And so the data matters. It's a baseline, and we can only all do better. Next slide, please. So land banks were established in New York State in about 2011. The governor signed the Land Bank Act, which is what gives New York State's land banks its powers. And it's really in response to 2008 foreclosure crisis, which provided more vacant properties than local governments can handle. So we are purpose-built to do all things around real property, vacant and abandoned real property. And so I highlight some of the key powers of land banks on this slide. But if you're interested and you're at the level of really wanting to dive in, you should check out the New York State Land Bank Act, because the powers of land banks in the state of New York are very broad. And admittedly, we're only starting to really, I think, scratch the surface of the potential of them as a tool to help neighborhoods recover. We have the authority to bond and a lot of things that we haven't started to dive into. And I know reclaiming brownfields and other potentially contaminated properties is becoming more and more of a topic nationwide. Next slide, please. New York State currently has 25 land banks. So most of the land banks in New York State serve at least one county. Some land banks serve just the city. So why it looks that way is that under the state legislation, foreclosing units of government, so foreclosing governmental units, ones that can have the authority under state law to foreclose on tax delinquent real property, have the authority to apply to the state to form a land bank. The legislation also allows land banks to form intermunicipal agreements, which means that two foreclosing governmental units can come together, two or more, to tap into the powers of one land bank. So the largest land bank that has done that in the state is the Greater Mohawk Valley Land Bank. That's shown on this slide. That's 4 counties, Herkimer, Montgomery, Otsego, and Schoharie, as well as the cities of Utica and Rome. And so Albany County's land bank is a countywide land bank. We have property and we do work in all 19 municipalities, but most land banks focus much of their resources to the areas that have the greatest need, which is, you know, pursuant to that map I showed you, typically the economically distressed neighborhoods, but they're certainly not limited to that. And there's lots of different types of properties that land banks can help intervene with. So this has been New York State's evolution of land banks, and the first wave the legislation originally allowed for 10 land banks to be formed, and that's on this map, how they were established. They started to prove themselves out pretty quickly, and so the state legislation then increased to 20 land banks, then subsequently to 25 land banks, and then when those slots were filled, the state last year approved an increase to 35 land banks are now able to be formed. And, you know, much like 2008, we're starting to see other parts of New York State express interest and take, you know, legislative measures to form their own land banks to give their communities every opportunity they have to brace for the impact that's coming, that's anticipated to arrive with respect to COVID-19 and all of the things that will come along with that. So I expect land banks to grow across the state and nationally. They're very powerful tools. And then, you know, per that poll that we took earlier, if you haven't engaged your land bank, you should. And if you haven't invested in your land bank, you should, because they're very powerful tools. And I haven't seen one that's set up to deal with vacant properties anywhere else like this in the state. So next slide, please. So this is just some of the things that land banks can do. I won't spend a lot of time on this. It's all in the legislation. But it was really anything around real property. There's a couple things land banks can't do, which is probably worth noting. A lot of people think because there's so much broad authority that they can kind of move mountains. And so again, land banks work well in partnership with different entities and local governments, but we can't, you know, we can't circumvent zoning. We can't eliminate taxes ourselves, at least the way we're set up at our land bank. And you know, land banks require resources. A lot of folks say, well, why can't land banks take every single vacant property? The economics of that just are not sustainable in terms of, like, these properties have been ignored for so long that it costs more to eliminate them or restore them than they're worth sometimes, and that's just a consequence of inaction. And you know, land banks can't absorb all liabilities unless they have the resources there. So land banks are not land trusts. There's been a lot of land trusts, as far as I know, were around. They predate land banks. Land banks came around, like I said, in the 70s. It really took off in the late 2000s. And land trusts are also starting to be revisited and expanded across the nation. And you'll hear a lot of talk about in community development about land trusts and land banks. And that's because we have similar types of work, but we're different in one way. Land banks acquire properties and then have to figure out how to solve the puzzle of each property to put them back to productive use. Land trusts want to acquire properties and put them under their trust model. Usually it's a tripartite model, and they want to own the property and preserve the affordability for, I guess, in perpetuity, essentially. So like land banks can get access to property, but we really typically don't want to hold property longer than we have to. We just want to figure out the best use for it. And you'll see that we have a pilot program here, but more and more land banks are discovering their neighbors at the land trust, and land trusts are forming in land banks, and there's lots of synergies there to work together, and they're very, very powerful when they can work together in terms of generating outcomes, but we are a little bit different. This is just a slide I put together to show, you know, where land banks' flexibility and the statutory authority can help. And this is us sitting between land banks as an entity between the private sector and local government. You see some of the flexibilities here. I think one of the ones worth highlighting is that land banks can go for the best outcome. So at least under state law in New York, the board of directors doesn't have to always accept the highest bidder, if you will, like the typical tax auction, because the highest offer isn't always the best outcome for any neighborhood or municipality or project goal or whatever your goals are that you're working together on. And a lot of the properties outcomes that we generate, the real estate market, the for-profit world would never generate because it's not a profitable business model. Another area where we stand apart is that we tend to have a more inclusive process and equitable in terms of, because it's not always highest bidder, it doesn't necessarily create obstacles for as many people. There are certainly still barriers to process things that have to be looked at, but a lot of people lack access to capital and get outbid at traditional auctions by people that have more financial resources, and then that's not overly equitable or inclusive in our opinion. And we tend to do more enforcement to make sure that whatever outcomes we approve happen and the property doesn't fall back or get abandoned and sit for another decade harming the community. This is just one of our pilot programs that we developed in 2017 out of a scholarship. This is online. I won't spend too much time on it, but this is a program where Center for Community Progress helped us work with our land trust to identify our strengths and their strengths and put together a program where we can help our land trust acquire properties in stronger neighborhoods that they usually get priced out of, and then they can create affordable housing for families in neighborhoods that typically they wouldn't be able to purchase property in, people of lower income. So it was one of those like flip the design models, and we are now have a partnership where we can give an opportunity for our land trust to make pockets of permanent affordable housing in neighborhoods where typically the market would appraise out, would value them out. And this is a program. This is just one of many examples of how you can work with your land banks and the programs we can come up with. This is in response to that exercise from a couple of years ago of mapping the redlining impacts over our real estate, and we tried to basically come together as a community, and our staff has really pushed this a couple of years ago, and say, what can we do to help address those disparities that have been caused for those systemic unjust practices? And this is just our way at putting together a pilot program to put all the little pieces in place that we can, that individually maybe aren't going to solve a problem or be overly meaningful, but when you align them in a row, pushing down a price here, giving a boost here, helping with closing costs here, you can create a pathway to an opportunity for a first-time home buyer that isn't available through traditional property acquisition. And it doesn't solve all the problems, obviously, but it's our way of being part of the solution. And there's a lot of different ways you can look at it, and you'll hear more approaches to land banking from the following speakers, but we just wanted to share those two. And both of these things are on our website if you want to learn more. And this is our first, these are our first, I guess, graduates of this pilot program who were able to purchase a property from us and rehab it. And so we're pretty proud of that, because it's a long road to get down for everyone. I mean, the average time to rehab a building that's been sitting vacant for 5 or more years takes at least a year of a lot of sweat and investment and time. And so whenever we get one back online, we're proud of it. We just want to show you that, basically. This is some other properties. We do a lot of rehabs. Actually, that's not true. We try to do as many rehabs as we can, subject to available funding. Our buyers end up doing most of the rehabs. These are 2 properties that we actually rehabbed ourselves, thanks to grant funds from Enterprise. But most of it is partnerships with buyers who we try to work with to make it possible. Next slide, please. And so as we amass real estate, our land bank is one of the largest in the state, and we've acquired over 1,200 properties in just about 5 years of operation. So we're putting a strategic lens on how can we help revitalize neighborhoods that have been disinvested for generations. And we realize that returning 1 or 2 properties at a time is certainly a step in the right direction, but it's not going to be as meaningful as a solution as if we use our authority in our real estate to kind of make something bigger happen. So we undertook an analysis of looking at, if you want to go to the next slide, I can dive in just one real quick. Where is our real estate? Where is real estate, vacant and abandoned real estate, by private owners, by other entities, by municipalities, by nonprofits? What happens if we put these puzzle pieces together? What does the market look like? What are good outcomes? When can we create, how can we create site control, which in real estate development is, usually half the battle after financing, and create an opportunity by taking these things that are viewed as liabilities that no one wants to touch, and use it, flip it, and use it in a way that can create value. And so if you want to go to the next slide, we've done that exercise here. We've picked, this is the South End in Albany. We have been strategically land banking properties, which is what we're designed to do. And, we are engaging, experienced developers to help us. And we're trying our first one in the South End. And our goal here is to not just sell the property and hope for the best outcome. We are actually engaging as a development partner to be a co-developer, because we have all the sites here, most of them at least, and bring our powers as a nonprofit developer to a for-profit developer who has sophistication and experience, and just try to create something that addresses both the economic needs of the relationship partnership, but especially the needs and priorities of the community that have been disinvested for so long. And so we want to help steer that and shape that. And we're excited to embark on this. We just actually issued a notice of award to our development partner this last week. So we'll see how it goes, but we have to try something, because it's incumbent upon us to do what we can with what we have, and more to come on that. I think that's it. One more slide. Oh, this is just a outdated snapshot of the performance of New York State's, the collective performance of New York State's land banks. There are more land banks active now, and we are actually doing this same exercise for our impact through the end of 2019, but we know that all of the numbers are heading in the right direction, because land banks work. They're proven to work. They've worked across the country, and like I said, I think you'll see more and more land banks popping up in cities and states across the country. And you may see them in cities that you don't think about land banks. You may see them to control the land grab that's coming for COVID-19. If you go to the next slide, that's my last slide. because it's real. The land grab is real. The economic pressures are real. We are feeling them here in upstate New York. We get many phone calls from all over the world, people that find our properties online that want to just buy as many as they can, cash offer, no plan, have never been to the area because they see an opportunity with the dip that's coming. And this has historically happened in neighborhoods many times. And without ways to combat those forces, you'll see a lot of predatory actions and things happening. And so COVID-19, you're looking at a potential storm of, there's an eviction moratorium, high level of unemployment, people can't make rent. Landlords that usually have smaller portfolios won't be able to make their mortgage or property payments. And so that means counties and cities aren't going to be collecting tax revenue, and eventually the dam will break. And I think personally and professionally, we're looking at an unprecedented wave of vacant properties over the next couple of years. So land banks are certainly one of the best tools out there to help combat that and confront it head on, as well as foreclosure prevention and other things that go beyond this discussion. But just worth noting, obviously COVID-19 is a very important thing to think about, and land banks are here to help. So with that, I will turn it over to Sarah Lansdale, who can take you through some of the great work they're doing at Suffolk County. And I'm looking forward to the panel discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Adam. I want to thank, special thanks to Jean Hammerman at the Center for Creative Land Recycling, as well as Claire, Weston, and all the speakers and sponsors of this event. Very excited to be a part of it. Just want to talk a little bit about the Suffolk County Land Bank. We're a little bit different than other land banks. As Adam mentioned, we were approved in the second round of land banks in New York State. And we actually had applied in the first round and we were not successful. And we requested all of the applications for the land banks that were successful and reviewed them and then resubmitted. So a lesson learned for us is if you don't succeed the first time, keep trying and you will be successful. So we are a land bank that is housed within Suffolk County government, local government. We have 6 county employees that spend anywhere between 10% to 75% of their time on land bank activities. We have a memorandum of understanding with Suffolk County. So anytime that we spend on the land bank, we account for it, and then through our sales of properties, we reimburse the county for our expenses. And that's a little bit unique. We have a 7-member board of directors with the county executive as the chair of the land bank. Then we have the presiding officer of the legislature, as well as the minority leader of the legislature. We have town supervisor who represents all of the town supervisors, as well as the regional director for the New York State Economic Development Corporation. We have our commissioner of economic development and planning, as well as our real estate director, who all sit on our board of directors. So with that said, this is just our land bank snapshot. We have currently 169 properties that are tax delinquent. And we'll get more into that in another slide. And so far, the cost of inaction at the county has been over $40 million in county taxes that have been paid out to local municipalities as per the New York State, the Suffolk County Tax Act, which is a New York State law, which requires that the county pay local municipalities their taxes, and that's town taxes, school district taxes, library taxes, whatever the local taxing jurisdictions are. We're responsible for paying those taxes if they're unpaid by the property owner. So our annual tax burden picked up by county taxpayers and by the county is $3.8 million on these tax delinquent properties. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, so I'm sorry. There were 11, so far we've sold 11 tax delinquent parcels by the land bank. We've generated over $2 million in tax lien sales, and they're first approved by the Suffolk County Land Bank and then by the legislature. And those properties, those 11 former tax delinquent parcels, are now generating $383,000 in taxes back to our local economy. So more importantly, what we've done is close a loophole in tax delinquent properties in Suffolk County. So I like to call this our scared straight model. We have generated over $7 million in back taxes by property owners who were tax delinquent and didn't want their property to be taken by the Suffolk County Land Bank to be sold. So that's been an ancillary benefit to the land bank. Next. So prior to the land bank's formation, we had, when brownfields properties became tax delinquent, they were flagged internally by county staff and on a interagency task force, and they were flagged as do not take properties. The county didn't want to assume the environmental liabilities for these properties. They had learned that lesson. They had taken some properties previously and incurred huge expenses to clean them up. So instead, they formed this do not take list. And at the time of our formation, we had 133 properties and over $33 million in back taxes owed to local municipalities. So really, that was a dead end. Once you were on, that property was on the list, nothing happened. And the list kept growing year after year. So the land bank was formed to disrupt that process and to perform due diligence, to perform phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments, and then to be able to sell the tax liens, which are then converted into full fee title of the property. Next slide. So our mission is to efficiently facilitate the return of distressed and underutilized properties within Suffolk County. And we attract private sector investment. And similar to what Adam previously said, we do due diligence on the prospective property owners who are interested in buying the tax liens and facilitate the disposition of these properties. Next. So the first step and the first activity that we undertook as a land bank was to understand what the inventory of properties were in our land bank. So we looked at and reached out to our partners on the environmental regulatory side to understand, and that would be the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, as well as the EPA, to understand what were the environmental constraints on the property. We also then, because we are county employees, we already have relationships with our county health department, which oversees enforcement actions regularly on underground storage tanks and other pollution activities, as well as our Division of Real Property, to get a real snapshot for each and every property in our land bank. And then we identified initial target properties or our low-hanging fruit to dispose of these properties. Next. So this is our environmental due diligence process. We, as I previously said, undertook an inventory, and then with funding from the Attorney General's office, as well as the EPA through their targeted site assessment grants, we were able to conduct a phase 1. The hardest part for us in the early days and early years of the land bank was how to gain site access to properties that the county didn't own and that the land bank didn't own. That took us a while to figure out, but we were able to do that through partnership with the Suffolk County Department of Health Services and the health departments or health commissioners warrant to access properties. So we conduct phase ones, and then if needed and if warranted, we conduct phase twos on those properties. We upload all of that information up on our website to make available to prospective purchasers. Next slide. These are just some photos of phase twos that were conducted on sites. And what's interesting is on my previous slide where I spoke about our ability to generate $7 million in back taxes that were owed, that usually occurs property owners. It becomes more real for property owners who are tax delinquent once we enter the site and conduct a phase two environmental site assessment. Usually it's after that site or right before we conduct the phase two is when we see payment for back taxes. Next. So I've mentioned this previously, we have a number of partnerships. We work with staff in our economic development and planning department. We also work with our Department of Health Services on accessing pollution records, as well as really relying on them for their technical expertise on how to approach the phase one and phase two environmental site assessments. And then we also work with our controller's office and sheriff's office as needed to gain site access and understand the prior tax liabilities on properties. In addition, we've partnered with the Attorney General's office to receive funding for the phase one and phase two environmental site investigations, as well as the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, where we actually executed an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding with the DEC as well as the New York State Oil Spill Fund to do a number of things. One is to coordinate information sharing and facilitate that information sharing among all of these agencies, as well as, more importantly, to share in revenue costs. So if the DEC or the Oil Spill Fund incurred costs to do a preliminary investigation or preliminary remediation on the sites, we, as per the MOU, proportionally share the revenue through the sale of tax liens with all of the various entities, be it the Suffolk County, the Oil Spill Fund, and the DEC, to facilitate the disposition of these properties. And I'll go through some examples in another slide. And I think most importantly, the MOU allows for liability protections for future landowners. So they're not saddled with the environmental liens that were placed on the property by these regulatory agencies. And they're obviously liable for any environmental issues or risks that they undertake from day one moving forward, but they're not saddled with those risks or liabilities that were incurred previously. So we sell at the Suffolk County Land Bank Corporation, we sell right now the tax liens, and then through an administrative foreclosure, the process, which is really just paperwork, those liens are then converted into tax deeds. And this, for us at the Land Bank, shields both the county and the Land Bank Corporation from any environmental liability incurred on any of these properties. We have, though, we are about to recently formed a subsidiary corporation, and thanks to Adam for sharing with us his models. And we are about to, sometime this year, put in our first, our tax liens and take ownership of a federal Superfund site. Next. So this is our property transfer process. It starts with an RFP. And then once the RFPs are reviewed, and we consult with the local municipalities as well as our partners, the DEC, on the end use, the proposed end uses of the properties to make sure they're consistent with local zoning. We talk to the local municipalities also to see what their experiences have been with the proposers, if there's any outstanding violations with on other properties that the proposers may own within that municipality. And then we receive approval from our board of directors to initiate the lien transfer process. And then we go to the legislature to receive the county legislature's process, and then execute a contract. And then we're able to facilitate the transfer of the tax liens into a tax deed. And what's important to note about this process is that we require both a down payment and then a real understanding on what the environmental issues are, and we either hold a bond or money in escrow and then tie the drawdown of that money towards the cleanup costs. And we're in close coordination with the DEC to understand where the new property owner is in the cleanup process, and mark those drawdowns or tie those drawdowns to the milestones reached in the remediation and redevelopment process. Next slide. Here's an example of one of the properties where we've sold the tax liens. You'll note that the property was tax delinquent for over 14 years. The annual taxes were $32,000. And something also important to note is that as the land bank, we and also the county, we were never able to and have not been successful in grieving the taxes. So if these property owners walked away and abandoned the properties without taking title to the property, we were not able to grieve the local taxes even. So we've sold this property for $50,000, the tax liens. And then next slide, you'll see the conditions at the time of sale. And then next slide. These are the after photos. It was successfully cleaned up and redeveloped into a storage facility. Next slide. So this is the former Hubbard Power and Light property. These some of these properties that we're highlighting have been on the county's kind of greatest hits list of environmental contamination for decades. You'll see that this property was tax delinquent for over 21 years. It had tax liens of $6.5 million. And anytime the town or regulatory agency stepped foot on the property, and this was home to a terrible fire, all of those costs were put on the tax bill. And for the years that it was tax delinquent, the county was paying those taxes. So the sale price of the property for the tax liens was $343,000, and the reuse, next slide. It's proposed to be a storage facility, and so these are some of the cleanup activities that are underway currently. This is another property. This was vacant for over 20 years. This is the Steck-Philbin landfill. It was a CND landfill. There were tax liens totaling over $1.5 million. The annual tax was $77,000. It was a CND. First, the prior owners mined the property for sand, and then it conducted landfilling activities with construction and demolition debris. It was a $600,000 sale price, and conditioned on the buyer's being accepted into the New York State DEC's brownfield cleanup program. So the end uses will be outdoor storage and a warehouse facility. In addition to our brownfields work, we also work on zombie home rehabs, and we focus on, as Adam has in his presentation, on the most economically distressed communities here in Suffolk County. This is, we partner with a number of organizations, including Habitat for Humanity and United Way. This is one property where we acquired the property through the NCST, which is the National Community Stabilization Trust, and partnered with United Way to build a zero energy home for a first-time home buyer who happens to also be a veteran. And we acquired the property for $75,000. Rehab costs were close to $350,000, and we sold the property for $375,000. We were able to do this at a loss to the land bank because of the grant funding that we received from the Attorney General's office. We also are looking at partnering with land trusts and land trust for a number of reasons, including and not limited to, we're exploring partnering with land trusts around creating housing for individuals who have disabilities, and looking at that as kind of another program model that we can roll out in the future. In addition, when properties become available through local municipalities as well as the NCST that are in the flood zone, what we want to make sure is that we don't repeat the mistakes from the past, and that we've transferred these properties back to local municipalities for demolition and for wetlands restoration, so that we don't house people, families, and make homes available for individuals who are first-time home buyers at an income restriction, who are in an area that will be flooded in the near future. So those are just some of the activities that we undertake at the Suffolk County Land Bank Corporation. Looking forward to hearing about all of the great work that Caitlin is doing, and thank you for the opportunity to present.
Sarah, thank you for that overview of what you guys are doing in Suffolk County. Between the two of you guys, you did a great job of teeing me up to explain what's going on here in Syracuse. This is Caitlin Wright with the Greater Syracuse Land Bank. I'm the executive director. Claire, it looks like you're, oh, there we go. That's the first slide. Yeah, I'm Caitlin with the Greater Syracuse Land Bank. We serve both the city of Syracuse and Onondaga County. If you want to advance to the next slide. We were jointly formed by Syracuse and Onondaga County in 2012, and we serve, seems to have jumped ahead a bit.
Sorry, hold on a moment. For some reason, the slides are moving forward on their own.
Oh.
But keep going.
Sorry about that.
I'll just like a timing on them or something.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Keep going and say advance, and I'll try and keep it on the slide.
Okay. So like I said, we serve both Syracuse and Onondaga County. Those are the two foreclosing governmental units in our county that jointly established the land bank in 2012. Between those two governmental units, they appoint our board of directors, and we have a 5-member board, one appointed by the mayor, one by the county executive, one by the chairman of the county ledge, one by the majority leader of the Syracuse Common Council, and then the 5th appointment is jointly appointed by the mayor and the county executive, and then has to be confirmed by those two legislative bodies. So they share control 50-50, but the vast majority of the work we do is in the city of Syracuse. They've made us the default recipient for all of their tax foreclosed properties. And it's our job to take those properties and return them to productive use. And we try to do that in a way that is really deliberate and strategic, so that we're coming up with some good plans for each of these properties and not just, selling them as quickly as possible to the highest bidder. One of the benefits of having a land bank is that you don't have to sell necessarily to the highest bidder. So our board of directors can take a number of factors into consideration when they're selling a property, and they can prioritize certain community objectives, like prioritizing homeownership, affordable housing, choosing not to list a property for sale necessarily if we're in the process of assembling it with an adjacent property to assemble a larger site for a bigger economic development opportunity, and that sort of thing. That said, we are primarily a middleman where we are getting properties stabilized, taking the time to do some of that site assembly, and then listing them for sale in as-is condition for the developers to come in and do the renovation work or the environmental remediation work if that's what's needed. Very rarely do we rehab a property or do that kind of environmental remediation, only when it's necessary because we can't get the private sector to do it, and when we have grant funds available to fund that kind of work. One area where we have not really been able to attract the private sector to make that kind of investment in cleaning up properties is when it comes to demolitions. About 30% of the structures we've gotten through the city's foreclosure pipeline have been delinquent and vacant for so long that they are beyond being able to be salvaged. And so we do spend quite a bit of grant money on demolitions simply because we can't attract private investors to spend money on that sort of thing. Oftentimes those lots will get purchased either by the next door neighbor to expand their yard or by a developer who's going to come in and build affordable housing. But either way, it doesn't make financial sense for a neighbor to spend $25,000 on a demo just to expand their yard a little bit, not in the Syracuse market anyway. And so we figure the land bank spending grant money to clean up that property is better for the tax base over the long term, because removing that blighted building is removing something that's depressing surrounding property values. So that's a big part of what we do, and then we do some grant funded rehabs. When we were first created, the city had about 4,000 seizable properties, and so they were catching up on those. And we figured about half would pay and half would be foreclosed on and conveyed to the land bank. To date, we've acquired just under 2,000. But the interesting thing is each April, new properties become seizable. About 800 to 1,000 properties in Syracuse become seizable. By the end of the year, most of them have either paid their taxes in full or paid the redemption amount, so they're no longer eligible for foreclosure. But each year, a few hundred more properties enter that foreclosure pipeline. So it may seem like we're nearly caught up since the city has foreclosed on almost 2,000, but in reality, we're only about halfway there. We have sold about 810 properties since we were first established. We've facilitated the renovation of about 478 projects. A handful of those we've done with grant funds, probably 50, but the vast majority of those are done by private investors. And we screen our local buyers to make sure that they don't have any code violations or tax delinquencies. We're trying to make sure that we're selling to responsible people that are going to not only put the property back on the tax roll, but also bring it up to code. So you'll see some of our other stats here. We can go ahead and advance to the next slide. Of those properties that we've sold, like I said, we are relying on the investors to do the renovations. So we've leveraged about $25 million in private investment in renovations. It's returned just over $26 million in assessed value to the rolls. And these properties are generating about $1.3 million in local property taxes annually. And we always remind the Common Council of that, of course, when we have to go back to them in budget season to ask them to financially support the land bank. We do bring in a lot of revenue each year off of the sale of real estate to support our day-to-day operations, but we have about 1,000 properties in our inventory right now, and keeping those mowed and insured and boarded up when we need to. We always operate in the red, despite bringing in about $1.5 million a year in sales. So we do need financial assistance from the city and the county in order to operate. But overall, I think they're getting a lot more back than they're putting in when you look at the fact that we're doing property maintenance at a much lower unit cost than they were ever able to, and we're putting all these properties back on the tax rolls. We can go ahead and advance. So like I said, the city's catching up on this backlog of several thousand foreclosable properties. And we, very much like Suffolk County has their do not take list, we also had a list of suspected brownfields that we were just kind of kicking to the back of the line. So if they're trying to catch up on 2,000 foreclosures, the last thing that they wanted to do was worry about dealing with brownfields because they were afraid of entering the chain of title. Both the city and the county have historically been reluctant to foreclose on brownfields and enter the chain of title. CERCLA does give foreclosing governmental units some protection from liability, but in New York State navigation law would make them liable for any petroleum contamination, and so that was really the source of their hesitancy. And even if they were willing and able to foreclose and convey these properties to the land bank, we didn't really have a good toolkit put together for what we would do with these properties. How do we go about testing them? How do we protect ourselves from liability of being in the chain of title? And then how do we market them for sale? So we, like we do with most challenges, we started looking around for other land banks that had already done this. And we saw the MOU that Suffolk County had entered into with the DEC. And so we contacted our region DEC here and started negotiating a very similar agreement. So that provided some indemnification to the city and the county and gave them the confidence that they could go ahead and foreclose on brownfield properties without the threat of being sued by the DEC. And the land bank is also included in this arrangement. We're given the same indemnification, and it gives us the ability to take a foreclosed property and sell it to a developer who's going to clean it up. In a minute, I'll talk about the testing that we do. Land banks also have the ability to create subsidiary LLCs. And before this MOU was signed, we thought that that might be an avenue for us to take title to some brownfield properties, even if we haven't done all appropriate inquiry prior to taking title like CERCLA requires. And the challenge there is that we mostly deal with tax foreclosed properties. And so if we don't have a willing property owner who's going to let us on site to do testing prior to taking title, we really couldn't, in most instances, perform all appropriate inquiry prior to taking title. So the creation of the LLCs was something that we thought we would use so that we could take ownership without having done all appropriate inquiry, but protect the rest of our assets from liability. It just so happens that our agreement with the DEC does not include the land bank's LLCs. So even though we don't have the protection of the LLC, we do have this indemnification from the DEC. So one way or the other, whichever avenue we take, the land bank has some level of protection. Go ahead and advance to the next slide. So we have the ability to take title to these properties, but then what do we do about the unknowns and how are we going to get them cleaned up and get them marketed for sale? We applied a couple of years in a row for a brownfield assessment grant from the EPA. The first year that we applied, we just applied on our own and we're not successful. The second year that we applied, we actually did put out an RFQ and selected a consultant to help us craft the application. And we applied as a coalition with the city of Syracuse and with the city's industrial development agency. But we didn't realize that same year the county was also applying. And so our consultant, we were unsuccessful again. Our consultant advised us that the EPA prefers to see some regional collaboration and we really shouldn't be competing with our own county, obviously. And so the third year we applied, we were successful. We applied in a coalition with the county industrial development agency and the city industrial development agency. So the three of us were really coordinated in that effort. And we were awarded a brownfield assessment grant in the June of 2019. We were awarded and we got under contract last October. Now that we're moving forward, most of the sites that we want to use their funds to do phase 1s and phase 2s on are seizable brownfields. So until we got that award, the city wasn't sure about foreclosing on these brownfields. It wasn't until late in 2019 that we actually got the MOU signed with the DEC as well. And so now that all those pieces are kind of falling into place, the city has been willing to start foreclosing on a couple dozen brownfields where we plan to use the EPA's money. And initially, my thinking was that we would have the city foreclose. They've got that protection from the MOU. We have protection from the MOU as well. We would take title, and then now that we have site control, can we go back one slide? Now that we have site control, we would actually be able to go spend the EPA's money on phase 1s and phase 2s. What I hadn't really thought out was that even though I'm not worried about having done all appropriate inquiry under CERCLA, That is a condition of the EPA's funding. Their EPA funds for these assessment grants are divided up into two categories: hazardous materials and petroleum contamination. And as it turns out, for the hazardous materials, we really need to do all appropriate inquiry prior to taking title. So our plan now is for the city to move forward with a couple dozen foreclosures on brownfield properties. Their foreclosure process can take nearly a year. So we're thinking late 2020 or early 2021, as they're getting towards the end of foreclosing on those properties, we would be able to do the phase ones without having site access. So there would be a little bit of a research gap in the phase one. Nevertheless, they would get the phase one completed prior to the foreclosure, and then shortly after the property is foreclosed and the land bank takes title, now they would have site access to go do the phase twos. So it's been a little bit of a learning process to coordinate with the city finance office that does the foreclosures and with our EPA regional administrator, but I think we've got a pretty good plan sorted out here for how we're going to approach these. Now that's required that we have to do that work prior to taking title with the hazardous materials funds, not necessarily with the petroleum funds. And so we do have one site already in our inventory where we've been able to use the petroleum funds to do a phase one, and we're hopefully very soon going to be starting the phase two. 200 Maple Street is a 48,000 square foot industrial warehouse that was built in the early 1900s as a bakery, a very large commercial bakery. It was added on to in a couple of different iterations through the 1930s to get up to that full size of 48,000 square feet. And it is eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's been vacant for well over 10 years now at this point. Initially built as a commercial bakery, like I said, and later just used for storage of Christmas decorations for a company that does municipal Christmas decorations all over New York. So not a ton of contamination risk on either of those fronts, but as a large commercial bakery, they did have a delivery fleet, so there was fueling stations and things of that nature associated with their vehicles. And then the building itself pretty much fills the entire parcel. So across the street, we have 3 parcels that were part of an old railroad right-of-way that are going to provide some space for off-street parking associated with this project. And so there is some more risk of contamination there. And with the EPA's assistance to do the phase one and the phase two on this site, we are teeing up our developers to take out a lot of the unknowns for them so that they can come up with their financing plan for any remediation that's needed. We did issue an RFP for this site shortly before we were awarded the EPA grants. And so we were looking for a preferred developer at that point who we would give an option to purchase in time for them to apply for last year's CFA funding in New York State. So they've been under option for about a year now on this site. They were awarded a CFA grant, and we're just now wrapping up, like I said, the environmental assessments so that they can move forward with remediation, hopefully by this fall, and then start doing renovations on the building. Their plan is to take this 48,000 square foot building, apply for historic preservation tax credits as well, and then to build a mix of affordable apartments, office space, a microbrewery, and have some artist lofts in the building. We're thinking as we move forward with additional sites where we're going to be doing these phase ones and twos, we may find that some of them are, well, for some of them, the idea is that we're going to quantify the extent of the contamination. Once we've taken out those unknowns, we're going to make them much more marketable sites and hopefully find private investors willing to tackle them. Or if the extent of the contamination is too great and the site is truly underwater, that gives us the opportunity to move forward and apply for cleanup grants. All right, next slide. I did promise CClear that I would also talk a little bit about cluster development today. One that is nearly complete now is Butternut Crossing, a site where we sold, I think, 18 parcels to a nonprofit called Housing Visions that's based here in Syracuse. They apply for low-income housing tax credits through New York State, and we had started getting a lot of foreclosed properties on Butternut Street through the city's tax foreclosure pipeline. And Butternut Street is difficult to market because it's pretty high traffic, and we had a lot of single-family homes that were in pretty rough shape on that street, many without any off-street parking, and owner occupants that are looking to buy in Syracuse are going to typically look for a quieter street. They don't want to be on something that has so much traffic. But landlords typically don't want single families. And they definitely want to have off-street parking if they're on such a busy corridor. So we were left with a lot of undesirable properties up and down Butternut Street. Butternut Street itself has some sort of stigma for some reason. On the north side of Syracuse, there is just a lot of vacancy and blight on this corridor. And so we knew that we needed a different kind of developer than the typical private developers that we attract. And so we did reach out to Housing Visions and ask if they thought they could take these properties and turn them into something much more attractive using government subsidies that they rely on. And they specialize in the creation of affordable rental housing. And their immediate response to us was, well, this checkerboard of properties that you have up and down the street is not going to work for us. We need much bigger parcels. And so we started going out and purchasing the parcels in between to assemble larger sites. Once we had that assemblage mostly put together, they were able to apply to the state for low-income housing tax credits. And I don't think they were awarded on their first try. I think it took them 2 or 3 tries to actually get funding, but eventually they were awarded and they were able to take title to these properties. They demolished most of the blighted homes that were there and constructed a series of new rental housing buildings that you see in this slide. The upper right house, though, was a rehab where they were able to take an existing home and renovate it. We were really pleased with the way that turned out. We can go on to the next slide. And I just wanted to show you this map of Butternut Street to kind of show the scattering of properties that we had up and down the corridor. And those teal colored ones are the ones that we sold to Housing Visions. And it shows how we had to kind of purchase some of the ones in the middle to put together a larger cluster for them. And we're working on similar strategies elsewhere throughout the city. That's one of the benefits of the land bank, is that we have very, very low carrying costs. We are tax exempt, so we're not paying property taxes on the properties that are in our inventory. And because we have such a large portfolio, our unit costs for insurance and mowing and that kind of day-to-day maintenance are relatively low. So we can get a scattering of properties like this through the tax foreclosure process and then slowly work to fill in the gaps, whether it's waiting for the property next door to become seizable or negotiating with the Syracuse Industrial Development Agency. In this case, in the map on the right, you see that we have a cluster forming and there's 2 parcels in the middle that are owned by SIDA. So we're working with them to acquire those. Or maybe it's conducting some private purchases like we had to do on Butternut Street. But after being in operation now for 7 years, more and more of these opportunities are coming up or coming to fruition. So this site on the right is a 1-acre site that's in the footprint for Blueprint 15, which is an initiative being sponsored by the city and the Syracuse Housing Authority right now, where they are working with purpose-built communities to re-envision what the Syracuse Housing Authority's campus should look like. And so this is just south of downtown. There's a massive amount of public housing owned by the Housing Authority. And right here, we're going to be able to put together an acre of vacant land, which is very difficult to come by in such a densely settled urban area. Once we've got that put together and Blueprint 15 has developed their revitalization plan for this entire neighborhood, then we'll be able to put out an RFP and attract a developer who wants to build something that's consistent with their plan. And the next slide. This just shows kind of a similar series of clusters that we're working on the south side. Again, we're partnering with Housing Visions, and you can see there a rendering of the types of 2-family homes that they're looking to build for the south side project. Right there on Colvin Street, I've highlighted where there's a senior housing project underway. St. Anthony's Church is still in operation right there at the corner of Colvin and Midland, but next door they had an old convent and elementary school that had not been used for many, many years. They eventually sold those properties to the city of Syracuse. Again, they were vacant for over a decade, and the city attracted a developer to come in who's building senior housing in the convent and school. And so all around that anchor, we have some clusters of foreclosed properties where we're putting together the red box that you see in the lower left there. By buying the property next door, I think we're going to be able to put together another 1-acre site. There's a developer interested in turning that into a mixed-use project where there would be a nationwide prescription or pharmacy chain, thank you. A nationwide pharmacy chain on the ground floor, and then affordable apartments upstairs, thinking that this would be a nearby opportunity for the senior housing project for them to have a pharmacy nearby and some basic shopping opportunities. And then further north on Midland, where you see all those yellow dots, we're working on assembling a pretty big chunk of land. That is zoned in such a way that it only allows 2 family houses, but we'll reconfigure the parcels so that there's enough space for them to fill in 5 or 6 2-family houses in that area. And that's it for me on cluster development.
All right, I'm back. So we have time for a couple of questions. We've had, by the way, people who have questions have been putting them up. And if you got other questions, throw them into the box so I can see them. But I wanted to couple a couple of the questions together and then ask the 3 panelists to address them. They sort of fall together. One is, was the land bank, and in particular, I know this question was going to Sarah, but maybe we'll just start with Sarah. Does Suffolk County require the a site to go through the DEC cleanup program? I know you did give an example where the one site went through the BCP, the brownfield cleanup program, but are they all required to do that? And I guess the second question, maybe you could just roll into the second question is, and I think you might have touched on this, but let's just make it clear. What is the your annual budget, if you can easily say what that is? Why don't we start with you, Sarah?
Sure. So we coordinate very closely with New York State and Department of Health, and if it's an oil spill, the oil spill fund, on what the cleanup requirements will be for the reuse of those properties. So it's not necessarily required to go through the BCP, the brownfield cleanup program, but it is. We remind all future owners that there is regulatory oversight by DEC.
Okay, so they can go through it at risk. You don't necessarily require that they have the DEC involved in, right?
Well, the DEC will oversee the cleanup of the property, or the health department, wherever it falls in the regulatory bucket.
So there will be some oversight. Okay.
Absolutely.
Good. What about on your budget? Can you talk to that? What does that generally look like?
Our annual budget is around $1.5 million, and that's largely driven by our acquisition costs for zombie homes, which is all grant funded.
Okay. Adam, why don't we throw those questions over to you about agency involvement in the cleanup at the end and your own budget?
So we haven't gotten too involved in the environmentally challenged properties outside of forming an LLC in accordance with our statute under law to limit liabilities, potential liabilities on properties that we don't have any reason to believe, formal reason, that they may have environmental issues, but we hear from community members that, potentially it was an informal garage where people worked on cars and it was in foreclosure. So we use that authority to do that. We haven't done anything near the level where Sarah and Caitlin are doing. Our county works separately on properties that may have environmental challenges. Our annual budget's around just over $3 million a year. And so a lot of that's driven by our Attorney General grant money, which is going by the wayside as far as we are aware at the end of this calendar year, save for a couple of grants that went out the door. A lot of our revenues come from our relationship with the county. So we are the default recipient for a lot of tax foreclosed properties. So we do keep a lot of the proceeds from the sales there. That helps our operation process all those properties for the county. And, we've looked at the numbers a bunch of different ways. We can get better cost than the county, and we just specialize in this. So we actually end up saving the county a couple $1 million, of course, over the past couple of years in demolition costs and other maintenance costs. So it's a good relationship for us.
Great. Caitlin, what about yourself?
Same as Sarah, it kind of depends on the site and what is needed, whether or not they're going to enroll in one of those programs and what their interaction will be like with the DEC. Our budget this year is just around $4.3 million, but that's largely because we're spending down a lot of AG funding, like Adam said. I would expect it to be much, much lower next year.
Okay, we understand that.
So
Claire?
Gary, it's just
Go
one
ahead.
other point that I wanted to make, which I forgot to mention, is that we have a $500,000 working capital fund, so which is dedicated for phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments. We knew when we established the land bank that the funding from the AG's office was going to be limited. So upon the sale of tax liens related to brownfield properties, that first 500,000 is kept by the land bank so that we could continue to do phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments. And that was legislation that was passed between the county and the land bank to establish that working capital fund. And it replenishes itself when we spend money out of that fund for environmental site assessments. And then when we have the next sale, it tops it off at 500,000, and then the remainder goes back to the county. So just wanted to explain that.
Right. Well, that's an interesting point then. That's a good point to make. One question, maybe just as a final one, because I know we're running up against time to a certain extent. It's all virtual though. How do people go back? Let's say people want to talk to you, Caitlin, or you, Adam, or you, Sarah, or your organization. What's the best way that they can engage with you? I know some might say, well, we'll wait for an RFP to come out or this or that, but I know, Sarah, I go to your board meetings sometimes, and it's just good to be involved in the conversation. I think part of it is engagement, but rather than me saying, just real quickly, what is the best way if people say, oh, how do I get in touch with somebody in this group? How do I do that? Sarah, why don't you, we'll come back to you. Start with that.
Sure. So we have a website, the Suffolk County Land Bank Corporation's website. It's a Google search. It's easy to find us.
Okay. Caitlin?
Sorry. We also have everything posted on our website. You know, our meetings are public meetings. They're open to the public. Even now in these times of COVID, you can still view our meeting online, just like you're viewing this webinar. So I would say, if you're interested in just generally learning more about the land bank, observing those meetings is helpful. You can also sign up for a mailing list at the bottom of our homepage, and when RFPs come out, you will get the RFP that way. And if you're just kind of interested in generally learning more, feel free to shoot me an email at info@syracuselandbank.org, and I can schedule a time for a phone call to let you know about some investment opportunities in Syracuse.
Cool. Adam, what you?
So same for us. We have a website. If you are a vendor or a contractor, you should definitely sign up for it. We routinely put out different procurements and business opportunities. If you're an individual, sign up for it too, because we have lots of open houses and virtual tours and workshops and things like that. Check out our website. We all put out different annual reports, and I'd be remiss, and Jean and Claire would be mad at me if I didn't say that I will also be hosting an office hours in connection with this on all things land bank, so you can just go to that and ask me questions.
Here we go. I like it. Well, you're pretty good, Adam. I like the way you smoothly went right into that. I'd rather than go into a lot more questions. I think, Claire, I'm going to throw it back to you. And thanks very much. And thanks for the opportunity to moderate this and be a part of this discussion. It's great.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you to all of you, all of the speakers, for your really insightful, your comments, and all the rich content. I do just want to offer a couple reminders. Thank you, Adam, for bringing this up. I do have a slide dedicated to it. So yeah, don't miss office hours this afternoon, specifically called It's in the Planning, Brownfield Opportunity Areas, Technology Platforms, Land Banks, and Other Programs that Spur Revitalization. So that's at 2 o'clock today. Join link is here on this slide, so you can download this presentation. You also would have received it in your reminder email. Also want to remind you that you can pose questions to panelists in the LinkedIn group. So that's another way that you can get your questions addressed. There are a number of questions that we weren't able to address on this webinar. So I do want to just mention that we will be doing some follow-up with speakers in the coming weeks and some post-summit, cleanup type thing. And we're hoping to send you some responses in the next couple weeks once we, catch our breaths. So that's all I have, and I really hope that you, yes, LinkedIn group, so there it is, there's that slide. I hope you stay in touch with C-Clear. Here's the contacts for our senior team, and I encourage you to join us for the other aspects of this summit, including office hours every day at 2, as well as the webinars tomorrow, placemaking, and then on Thursday on solar and renewable energy in general. So don't miss those, and then the peer-to-peer meet and greet. Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this first webinar. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Barry from GAIG. And thank you, Jean, for filtering through those questions. It's a team effort. Have a wonderful day, everybody. And I will hopefully see you virtually at some point this week. All right, have a good one.